Hey everybody, Phil Webb here from the Spring Boot team. Last November we released Spring Boot 2.4 and I wanted to record a short video then to show you what's new. However, like a lot of 2020, things didn't exactly go according to plan. So a little bit later than expected, here's what's new in Spring Boot 2.4. Let's get into it. So I'm going to start by creating a small demo application so we've got something to talk about when we're looking at the new features. To do that, I'm going to head over to start.spring.io. I'm going to select Maven project as my project type. I want to pick the 2.4.2 snapshot version. This is because there's a few bug fixes that we've made. By the time this video comes out, 2.4.2 should be GA, so you'll be able to select the latest GA version and things should work fine. I'm going to leave these defaults as they are, pick WAR file, and I'm going to add a few dependencies. I'm going to add a web dependency, and I'm also going to add the actuator dependency. I'm then going to click generate and save that project. If I go to a terminal, I can just move that project over from my downloads folder. And I can unpack it. And then I'm going to import it into an IDE. In this case I'm using Eclipse, but if you're using IntelliJ or VS Code, everything should work in pretty much the same way. So here we are in Eclipse. I'm going to do import project. I'm going to pick existing Maven project and I'm going to paste that directory link in and then just import this project into the IDE. There we go. Now I want to create a new controller, so we've got something to return some web traffic. So I should call this a demo controller. Should make this a REST controller. And I'm just going to do a request mapping to the slash path and then a simple string response. Now rather than returning string here, what I want to do is actually delegate to a service. So let's just create a new service. I'm just going to call it demo service and some method in it. And then I can create a local field for that. And I can create a class. And then I'm going to use constructor injection to get that in. So I just have a demo service and assign that to the field. Then we can create the method. So this method is going to be go, and this can return hello world. Now I actually want this service to be a little bit naughty, so I'm going to put in a thread sleep, and I want to make that thread sleep configurable. So I'm going to create a constructor on this service, and I'm going to pass in something called wait properties, which we're going to create. If I just create a class for now, and we'll come back to that, and then I can just do thread.sleep properties.forTime. And I'm going to make this actually a duration type from the JavaX time, and let's just change this to the millisecond to millis. And that's going to throw an exception, which I'm just going to pass up because I don't really care about it. And we need to make this a service so that Spring can find it. So this is a demo service bean. It's going to return hello world when you call the go method, and when it starts up it's going to sleep for some configurable amount of time so that we can demo some features later. Let's just finish off with the wait properties. So I need some kind of field for this, and this is going to be a configuration properties object. So to do that I need to annotate it with configuration properties. I need to tell it that I'm using constructor binding, and then I need to put a default value in here as well. Let's go with default value of 0. And my IDE here is giving me a warning telling me that I should add a configuration processor. So let's just go ahead and do that. And then the one more thing that I need to do to get those configuration properties to work is to add a configuration properties scan annotation to my main class. Okay, so we have our main class, which has got configuration properties scanning and Spring Boot application annotations, and the main method. We've got a controller that delegates to some service. We have a service that is going to start up and sleep for a set amount of time, and then a service method that just returns hello world. And we have some configuration properties that allow us to configure the time. Oh, one thing I must do is put the prefix that I want in for this. Actually, to make things a little bit easier as well, let's just put a system output. Let's put sysair for the time that we're actually going to be waiting, just so that we can see that it's doing something. Right, let's see if we can run this application. So here we go, the application starts up. We can see the 0 output because that's the default time. If we go to our application properties, I can put wait for time equals, let's just put 1 second. Run this application again, and you can see the time changes to 1000, and you notice that little pause as well as our application starts up. Okay, so we've got a small demo application with some things that we can talk about. Let's have a quick look at some of the changes that you might need to make to an application if you're going to be upgrading from Spring Boot 2.3 or before. And as always for that, it's best to check out the wiki. So on GitHub, under our wiki pages, you can see Spring Boot 2.4 release notes, which has a whole bunch of upgrading instructions and some information about things that are new and noteworthy. So the first thing on that list that I want to talk about is the version number, which has changed. If I head back to start.spring.io and select version 2.3, and then I just do this explore button here, you can see that the version number for 2.3 used to be 2.3.7.release. And this .release thing was a little bit of a hangover from the old versioning scheme that Spring used to use. And with newer versions, we've simplified things. So if you pick 2.4 and do explore, you'll see that the version number no longer has this .release suffix. So if you're upgrading from Spring Boot 2.3, you will need to know to not only update the version number, but drop that .release suffix. This new scheme really is just a simplification. So the version numbers are kind of easier to use. They work better with comparison tools. And if you're looking at other products in the Spring portfolio like Spring Cloud, you'll notice that they've changed as well to a calendar-based scheme. There's a blog post about this on spring.io website. And the next thing on that list that I want to talk about, if we head back to the release notes, is that JUnit 5's vintage engine is no longer shipped with Spring Boot. So if you upgrade from Spring Boot 2.3 and you find that test annotations aren't importing correctly, or you're missing org.JUnit imports, you will need to go ahead and either add the vintage dependency back in again or migrate to JUnit 5. If possible, we'd recommend migrating to JUnit 5. If you do want to upgrade, this little snippet here in the release notes is all you need to add to your POM file. And the equivalent Gradle is also shown just below. The next big thing that you should be aware of if you're upgrading an older Spring Boot application is the way that we process application.properties and application.yaml files has changed quite significantly in this release. If you find that you've got problems with your properties and they're not loading in the way that you expect, then you can set this spring.config.use legacy processing property to true, and you'll get the old behavior. However, we really recommend, if possible, that you upgrade to the newer style support. So if you do find that there's problems and the release notes aren't answering your questions, then please raise an issue on GitHub and we'll try and help you. One of the more common problems you might encounter when upgrading to do with the new configuration processing logic is that if you use spring.config.location to define specific locations to load when you start your application, you might get an exception telling you that a location doesn't exist. This is because we've made locations mandatory in this release, so they need to exist. If you don't want that, then you have to prefix them with optional. So this change is to help you catch configuration problems early. So for instance, if you said I want to import something from a folder and the folder was missing because you mistyped maybe the name of it, then you'll get an exception now and you have to go and fix that problem. So if you are upgrading and you hit that problem and you've got things that you don't really mind if they're there or not, just prefix them with optional. There are a few other sections of the wiki that I won't cover here, but you should read up on yourselves, especially if you use H2, HSQL, DB or Darby as your main database. Also, if you use Neo4j or Flyway, you should check out the upgrading instructions as well. One thing that I will cover is Logback configuration properties. So this gives me an opportunity to show a little feature of Spring Boot that some people don't know about. If we look at the release notes, we can see that some configuration properties have changed. So specifically, things that used to be kind of general purpose logging properties have been renamed to more accurately reflect the technology that actually supports them. So for instance, logging.max file size has changed to logging.logback.rollingpolicy.max file size. Now, if you've got one of these properties in your application, so if I just head back over to our demo application and stick one in, you'll see here I've got a little yellow underline warning on my IDE. This is because the IDE that I'm using knows how to read a metadata file that we ship with Spring Boot. So if I hover on that warning, I can see that the property is deprecated and it tells me that I can switch to a new one as well. Now I can fix this using an IDE shortcut, but if you're not using an IDE that reads these metadata, you might want to look at the Properties Migrator module. The Properties Migrator was a module that was introduced around Spring Boot 2.0, and it was really designed to help users that were upgrading from Spring Boot 1.5 to 2.0, where we made a lot of changes to property names. But the module still exists and it can still read the metadata that we ship, and it's still quite useful. So if I want to make use of it, I can go to my POM and I want to add an extra dependency. So I'm going to add Spring Boot and then Properties Migrator. And what this module will do is when your application starts up, it'll scan all the properties that you've defined, and if they are deprecated and it's got alternatives, it will give you logging that will help you migrate your application. So if I run this app now, what you'll see here is that this property source here has got logging.file max size. It tells me the line and it tells me what I should be replacing it with. Now bear in mind that this functionality doesn't come for free. Obviously when your application starts, it's got to read that metadata and scan all of your properties and see if they have been deprecated and suggest alternatives. So what we recommend doing is putting this module in if you need it, starting your app, fixing all the problems, and then removing the module when you're done. So in this case, I would go to my application properties, fix the problem. In this case, I'm just going to delete it. And then when my application starts up without any errors, so if I run this again, you see things are fine, I'd then just remove this module so that it's not adding any startup overhead. All right, let's move on to some of the new features that we've got in Spring Boot 2.4. And the first one that I want to show you is support for Java 15. So if I go back to my POM file, you can see here I've got Java 11, which was the default version that start.spring.io gave me. I'm going to change this to Java 15 and then update my Maven project. And what we'll see here is that the JRE system dependencies has changed to Java 15. Something else that we've done is we've added some logging to the application startup. So if I run this application again, just to show you here, you can see started demo application, and we now print the version of Java that's being used as well. And we have a CI setup that tests Spring Boot against Java 8, Java 11 and Java 15, so you're free to pick any of those versions. One thing to be careful of though is if you are an Eclipse user, make sure that you're using Eclipse 2020/12 because this is the first version that ships with full Java 15 support. The next thing I want to show you is to do with the properties object that we had. So if I go back to my IDE and focus in on this wait properties object. Now, there's a few things to show you here. First of all, we've already talked about having this default value, and we have this duration which we're using for our actual property type. Now, duration actually has built-in converter support with Spring Boot, so you may not be aware that you can specify these properties in several different forms. So I can put 1 as a simple value, or I can put 1s for seconds, m for minutes, h for hours, etc. Now, if you have the simple version, so if you just have a 1, you might want to use another annotation called duration unit. So if I put duration unit in here, what this is saying is this is the value that should be used if you don't specify one specifically. So if I change this to, let's change it to seconds, for example, then when I start the application, even though I've just got 1 in here, you'll see that I get 1,000 here because it's picking that 1 and treating it as a second. If I change that to like millis, start it up again, you'll see that it goes back to 1. And the duration unit annotation has been in Spring Boot for a while, but previous to Spring Boot 2.4, it wouldn't work with constructor binding. Something else that I might want to do here is I might want to make this a little bit easier to read. So this for time is a little bit ugly. Let me change that to 4. So I want a property called wait.for. So I can easily do that. I can change this method. Let's call this getFor. I'll keep the property the same here, and I can change this parameter so that the correct version picks up. And right here you can see a problem. So the way that constructor binding worked in Spring Boot 2.3 was that if you had a parameter, the name of that parameter would be what was bound. So right here I want to use the name for, but I can't because for is a reserved Java word. So I have to keep my parameter name something different. But in Spring Boot 2.4, what I can do is I can use this new name annotation to override the name. So here I can put name, and I can say I want the name as for. Let's just get rid of this duration unit thing for now. And run that again. So there you go. You can see we've got wait.for as our property name, and the name is picked up here using the annotation, even though the parameter name and the field name is named something different. You might be wondering why I've decided to make that service sleep for a certain amount of time, and that's because I want to demo another new feature that's actually a Spring Framework feature, but something that we're surfacing in Spring Boot. I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to change my property back to a second so that this service is behaving badly. And then I'm going to make a few changes to my main method so that I can plug in something new. So the first thing I want to do is, if you didn't know already, this run method is actually a shortcut for a new Spring application with the class.run. So those two things are functionally equivalent. And you might want to use the non-shortcut version if you want to change things about your Spring application class. So let's just extract that as a variable, and then I can configure things on it. In this case, the thing that I want to configure is something called ApplicationStartup. So I'm going to do set ApplicationStartup, and then it expects an ApplicationStartup interface. The ApplicationStartup interface is actually a Spring Framework interface. If we jump into it, you'll see it's quite straightforward. Let's just go through. It basically has one method called start. You have some kind of logical name and then a bunch of steps that get applied. And the idea behind this interface is it allows you to get metrics out of Spring Framework itself. If you've ever tried to profile a Spring application, you might find that it's quite difficult because you end up in the same kind of create bean method a lot, and it's hard to tell which actual bean is the problem. when you're profiling. So this interface allows you to get like much more detailed heuristics about your application as it starts. I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to set one of these startup classes, and the first one that I want to show you is the flight recorder one. So if I do flight recorder application startup, then what this is going to do is it's going to plug in into the Spring's metric system a link to Java flight recorder. We can jump and look at this class, and the Java doc provides some more detailed instructions about the things that we need to do to actually get flight recording going. So I'm going to need to copy this command. Let's go back over to my folder. I want to make sure that I'm using Java 15. Whoops, Java 15.01. And then I can package up my app, and then I can run that java-jar command with my packaged application. So here we go, application starts up, we get that second delay again. I'm going to close it down. Java Flight Recorder is available on all open versions of Java, including version 8, but you have to be on a fairly recent build. If you want to open that file, there's something called the Java Mission Control that you can use. So here I have Java Mission Control. I'm going to open up that file. There it is. And then I can see some of the contents. So as well as getting all the kind of method profiling information that you're used to if you've used Java Flight Recorder before, if we jump down to the event browser, you can see that right at the bottom here, we have some Spring events. And if I look at the startup steps, right here we can see that top of the heap is context refresh, which is kind of the outer step, the thing that the full context load. But just below it we can see like 1 second for a spring.beans.instantiate step. And if we head over to the right, you can see that Spring has added some tags to this thing. So not only do we know that we have an instantiation that's taking a long time, but we can tell exactly which service it is that's caused the problem. Another implementation of Application Startup that we provide is one called Buffering Application Startup. And if I go back to my application, I can switch out the Java Flight Recorder for the buffering version. I need to give it a number of entries that I want it to hold, and I'll just pick a fairly large number for this. And what that buffering one will do is it will take the events that happen and it will store them in memory, and it will allow you to get back at them later. And one of the ways that you can get back at them is via an actuator endpoint. So let's go back to our application, and I need to open up my actuator endpoints. So I'm just going to select exposure for my actuator endpoints, and I'm going to include everything. At this point, if I run my application again, we should still get that second delay, and this time we should have an actuator endpoint available. So if I head over to a web browser and look at localhost 8080/actuator, I'll get a list of the endpoints that are available, and one of the ones that I can see here is a startup endpoint. Do bear in mind that if you haven't configured the buffering application startup in your Spring application, that this endpoint won't appear. To use that endpoint, I can just grab it and let's just do a curl. I have to actually do a post to this endpoint because it consumes the data. And then I can pipe it. Let's pipe it through JQ so we get some nice formatting, and then give it a less. So here you can see the same information that was in Flight Recorder is available as a JSON structure that you can do with it pretty much whatever you want. If I look at the demo service here, you can see the same information we had before: when it starts, when it ends, and the duration. We're quite excited to see what people will do with this new feature. As I say, we provide 2 implementations of that interface out of the box, but you can also easily develop your own. Let's move on now to have a look at something else. I want to talk about configuration properties. And to begin with, I want to talk about YAML. So as you know, Spring Boot supports property files, which have been around in Java for ages, but it also supports YAML. And if you've used YAML before, if I just create a application.yaml file, you may or may not know that YAML allows you to have multiple documents in a single file. So here, for instance, I could have maybe some application name set here, and then I can put 3 dashes into this file and have a different name that's active when a certain profile is active. So for example, I can have spring.profiles, and then I can say prod, and then the name would be something different. Now, being able to have multiple documents in a single file is a really nice feature of YAML and something that a lot of people find very useful. However, not everyone wants to use YAML, so what we've decided to do is try and implement the same feature using property files. So if I just delete this YAML file, starting with Spring Boot 2.4, you can have a special construct. You can have a comment followed by 3 dashes, and that will have the same effect as in the YAML. This is acting as a document separator. So this property file now contains 2 different properties. So maybe I can change the for value in production so that it's a lot less, and I can put that in the same spring.profiles prod. If you didn't know already, the spring.profiles property here is actually an expression. So if I wanted to, I could say that I want to change this value in the prod profile or the test profile. And whilst that's quite nice, it does cause some confusion, especially if you have multiple profiles. So for example, if I put a 3rd document in here and I make this one only available in the test profile, then the question is, like, what happens if the test profile is active? Which one of these will win? If I change this to like 10 seconds and this one to 5 seconds, it becomes quite hard to know which of these documents is actually going to be applied. So starting with Spring Boot 2.4, there's a really simple rule now. Anything that's lower down in the file wins, and that goes for both properties within a document and documents themselves. So in this example here, we have a property that's set that's 1 second, then 10 seconds, and then 5 seconds. If I change this application, let's just set a profile. Let's set the test profile to active. So if I run this application now, what's going to happen is we'll see 5 seconds being used. So this is because 5 seconds is the lowest active document that's available. So you can see here it's going to activate the test profile. This is going to match because prod or test is true, so we get 10 seconds. But this one is also going to match, so we get 5 seconds. So anything lower down will win. If I reorder this, so if I take this one and stick it above and then run the application again, this time we get 10 seconds. So you can see the lower one always wins. Hopefully these new rules will make things easier to understand. However, if you are upgrading a Spring Boot 2.3 application, this is one of those areas where I was saying you need to take care. You need to make sure that your properties, if you've got a complicated setup like this, are being loaded in the order that you expect. Let's have a look at something else. For the keen eyes among you, you may have noticed that this spring.profiles property has actually been deprecated, and I've got a yellow warning. So I'm going to go ahead and replace that with the alternative. I'll do that for both of those. And then if I, let's just run this application again, just show you that it works in exactly the same way as before. I get 10 seconds. So the reason we've changed this property is we think the new one's slightly clearer, but also it doesn't overlap with other properties. So you may have noticed that spring.profiles, the property, was a subkey of spring.profiles.active or spring.profiles.include, which made it quite hard to work with if you're writing a YAML file. The new one also gives us an opportunity to add different types of activation. So one that I can show you here is I can do spring.activate on cloud platform, and here I can pick, for instance, Kubernetes. So let's change this to be activated on Kubernetes, and then up here I'm going to set my cloud platform just to pretend we're on Kubernetes so that I don't actually have to deploy the app. And if I run this app again, you'll see we get 10 seconds as expected. If I change the cloud to, say, Heroku and run the app again, this time it goes down to 5 seconds. It's possible that we'll add more of these activation properties at a future date as well. Let's move on and look at something else. You can see here that our properties file is starting to get a little bit unwieldy, and you can imagine in production we may have many of these sections and many properties set, and things start to get even worse. And people often want to take their configuration files and split them up a little bit. One way we often see people do this is to abuse the profile support, so they'll end up creating profiles just so that they can have application-profile name property files and separate their config a little bit. With Spring Boot 2.4, this is no longer necessary, and you can make use of a feature called spring.config.import. Bear in mind that you can only use this feature if you've not set that legacy processing mode. So as long as you're using the new configuration property processing code, you can make use of imports. And what you can do with an import is you can tell one configuration property file to import another. So for instance, here I might say, let's import something called example.properties that I expect on my class path. If I create one of those files, let's get a new file, example.properties, and I can put like wait.for equals, let's go like 2 milliseconds. I can actually import more than one file if I want to, so I could put a comma here, and this is a list, so I will be able to say let's have example2 and example2 properties, and let's change that to 4 milliseconds and get rid of this. So we have now our main application properties is 1 second, and we are importing an example properties file and an example2 properties file. If I run this application, what we get here is the value 4. So that's the value from example2. So again, as with the other ones, we're trying to be consistent. Anything that's lower in the list will win. If I switch this round, and load example2 before example and then run it again, you'll see this time I get 2. So this time it's picking up the 2 millisecond value. We can also have property files import other property files. So for example, I could have spring.config.import here, and maybe this time I'm going to load up from my home directory. Let's load up demo and create a file called x.properties. And if I stop this app, jump over here and create a file called x.properties. So let's just cat some value. So let's just echo some value. Let's just echo 6 milliseconds. Wait, not 4 equals 6 milliseconds to x.properties. And if we head back and run this application now, what we'll get is an exception because I've got the wrong format here. I've got the wrong directory. I'm in demos, not demo. So this is one of the examples I was talking about earlier. Now we're much stricter about when you specify values, that if you do actually make a typo like I did, then the application is going to shout at you. Run this again, and you can see we get 6 seconds. One other neat feature you can do with these imports is that you can have files without any extension. So if I if I move this x.properties and just call it ext, previously Spring Boot wouldn't know how to load that file, and some cloud providers would not allow you to actually write files with extensions. So with Spring Boot 2.4, if you want to, you can put that extension in square brackets, and that's going to say, I expect the file to be called this, but because you haven't got an extension, I want you to treat it as a properties file. If I run the app, we should see that behaves in exactly the same way. Obviously, it's pretty easy now to get in the situation where you've got files importing other files, and it can be hard to tell where a property might actually originate from. So in order to help you with this, we've extended the origin support that's in Spring Boot so that we have something called origin chains. And an origin chain will give you a complete list of all of the origins involved with providing a value. I can show you that with a quick demo. With this application running, if I head back to my actuator endpoint and look at the config props endpoint, you can see here that I have configuration property beans, most of which are provided by Spring Boot itself, but my wait properties is the one that I defined. And I can see the properties, the value of it, so that's 6 milliseconds. And I can also see where the value came from. So here I can see that the actual value was specified as 6ms, the string 6ms, and the origin is from this file here. But the origin parents will give me a complete chain. So I can tell that my actual file that it's loaded from was imported from the example properties, which was imported from the application properties. And this is complete right down to the line and column number. So if I look at application properties, here I can see that line 4, column 22, just down here at the bottom of my screen, is the actual value that was loaded. And likewise, if I look at the example properties, it says line 2, column 22. So I know precisely where any particular value has come from. This also works with the env endpoint. So if I do env and wait.for, which is the property I want to home in on, again, you can see the source of these values, where they've come from, and this origin and origin parent chain. The origin interface is something you can use in your own code as well if you want to. It's part of the main Spring Boot package, so origin, there it is, and I can you can see it's a simple interface. It has to have a toString that makes sense, and what's new in 2.4 is this getParent method, which allows an origin to tell you its origin, its parent origin, and there's a couple of convenience methods if you want to get the origin from a source object or the parents from a source object as well. The other one that you may often use as well is the origin lookup class, which allows you to have something that provides the origin given a key. So all of our property sources implement this. So you can say, get me an origin given a key. So that's how our property sources work. For instance, the environment actuator endpoint you saw, it can say, given this key, what's the origin of that key? One of the things that's interesting about this new import support is it's quite flexible. So as well as being able to import property files and YAML files, we can actually support brand new types of property sources. And one of the ones that we've provided in Spring Boot 2.4 is something called a config tree. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to head back to my terminal and I'm going to create a folder structure. So I'm going to create a directory called tree with a subfolder called wait, and then I'm going to echo let's put 8 milliseconds into a file called tree.wait and then 4. And this slightly odd structure might be familiar to you if you've used Kubernetes before. So Kubernetes allows you to do something called volume mounted secrets. And volume mounted secrets often have this format. You have a basic tree structure where the name of the file is the name of the property and the contents of the file is the value. So for instance, in this case, if I cat wait/4, you can see that we have 8 milliseconds as the value. And if I want to import this value into my application, I can go back and let's just simplify our properties a bit more and get rid of this, and I can use something called a config tree as the import type. So here I can do config tree user.home/demo/tree. If I run this application now, you can see we're getting that 8 millisecond value that's come from here. So if I look at Actuator and just refresh this page, you can see that the source this time is a config tree, and this is the root folder. As with other imports, these values are mandatory, so that folder has to exist. If I want it to be optional, I can head back and prefix it with optional, like that. I don't want to get too in the weeds of how this actually works, but it might be useful to have a look at the way that config tree thing is implemented, because you can actually develop your own import support if you want to. So for this one, I want to have a look at config tree, and then the classes that I want to show you are, you need to do two things if you want to support your own locations. You need to provide a config data location resolver, and you need to provide a config data loader. And then you also need to have a specific type that you develop that represents the thing that you want to load. So in this case, you can see that the way the resolver works is this interface has got just three methods, like is this thing resolvable, is this location resolvable, can you please resolve it for me, and then if you've got profile specific support, you can also deal with that as well, but most users will probably just want to implement this one. So in our case, our resolvable ones are anything that's prefixed with config tree, and when I actually resolve it, I just go and get the path that I want to use and put it in one of these config tree data resource types. Then for the loader, it's just a simple case of taking that resource and returning this config data type, which is basically a small wrapper around a property source. In this case, we have a config tree property source, which is a new type of property source that knows how to read those folders and file contents. If you do develop your own location resolvers and loaders, make sure that you register them in the spring.factories file so that Spring Boot can find them. You might want to look at some of the other Spring projects. For example, here's Spring Cloud Vault, which recently added support, and that'll be in Spring Cloud 2020. For the final part of this video, I want to talk about our Docker support and show you some of the updates that have been made since we first introduced it in Spring Boot 2.3. To do that, I'm going to head back into my project demo directory, and I'm going to issue the Maven command spring boot build image. This command will take a little while the first time it runs, as it's got to download a load of Docker images and download a JDK, but the second time should be quite quick. So here you can see it's taken about a minute to build this image. What I want to do is use a tool called Dive to show you the contents of that image. Here we are in Dive. I'm going to just tab over here and turn off unmodified so that we can just see what's in each of our Docker layers. And the first thing that I want to point out is that if you did this in Spring Boot 2.3, when we get to the bottom few layers that are added by the Spring Boot app, this in Spring Boot 2.3 would have been one large layer unless you'd explicitly switched on layering support. And in Spring Boot 2.4 we flip that default, so you get layers out the box. So here you can see that we've got all of our jars, followed by our launcher classes. Then we have our snapshot jars. In this case, because I was using that snapshot version, we've got that layer. Most production apps won't have snapshot jars. Then we've got our own code, which is the stuff that we've written for our app. And then finally there's a few bits and pieces that the Buildpack adds, metadata and such like. One thing that I want to point out is if we go back up to our Spring Boot jar dependencies, there are no longer any Spring Boot starter jars in your application. And this goes for both the Docker images as well as jars that you create using the Maven command line or the Gradle command line. And the reason for this is if you've used starters, what they're generally used for is to pull in other dependencies. So for instance, if you say I want the Spring Boot web starter, it'll give you Tomcat and Spring MVC, etc. But the actual starter jar itself is pretty useless in an application. It's always empty and there's no functionality that it provides. So starting with Spring Boot 2.4, we kind of filter them out for you, so it just makes loading your app a little bit quicker. Something else that we've done is try to automate multi-module projects. So if you've got a Maven project that's made up of multiple modules, so for instance, maybe you've got like a separation between web and services, then when you build a Docker image now, we will automatically put all of those Maven modules that are part of the same reactor into the same layer, into the application layer, rather than being in the jar layer. So this helps if you've got an application that's changing often, then those layers are kind of combined. So you're no longer mixing your dependencies with other dependencies like JSON or things that are more stable. One of the more popular feature requests that we got after Spring Boot 2.3 was to add support for private registries. So right here I'm going to look at a Harbor instance that I've got installed. I can log in with the default credentials of Harbor 12345, and you can see that I've just got an empty Harbor instance. There's nothing in the library as yet. I've just got a private registry installed. If I want to publish my Docker image to this registry rather than to the local Docker daemon, then I need to do some configuration. You can find the information in the reference guides. So in this case I'm using Maven, so I go to the Maven reference guide, and then I want to go down and have a look at packaging OCI images, and then under the examples I can look at image publishing, and there's an example here that shows you how to configure this to use a private repository. So in this case I'm going to take this configuration and I'm going to head back to my project and update my POM file. So I need to find the Spring Boot Maven plugin and then add this configuration. In this case I need to pick a different name for this because I don't want it under docker.example.com. I want it under my Harbor install, and I also need to update this URL, and I don't need that, but I do need some proper credentials. If I run the build image command again, so if I head back over here and do Maven Spring Boot build image, this time it should be a little bit quicker. Now at the end we're getting a publish command, so you can see it pushing this image to my Harbor registry. Just wait for that to finish. There we go, head back over to Harbor, and we can see now that my I have an actual entry in my library. It's pushed the artifact and it's given me the SHA that it's uploaded. One final thing that we could do is just run this application in Docker to prove that it works. I'm going to copy the pull command and then I'm going to do docker run. I'm going to forward the port 8080 to 8080 and then just get rid of this bit, and hopefully that should run. There we go, Spring Boot 2.42 snapshot starting the application, and if I head back over here and type localhost 8080, we get the hello world endpoint that we added right at the start. So I really hope this quick overview has been useful to you. Spring Boot is continuing to release versions on a time-based process now, so we're going to release every 6 months. If you want to know when the next version is going to be out, you can always head over to GitHub and have a look at the milestones page. So 2.5 is due on May the 20th, and hopefully we'll have some more features to show you and another video to upload then. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.